a whisper in the dark, or a clue no one dared to follow. Welcome to Echo Mysteriosa. I am your host, Avella. This community keeps growing. Tell me where you're listening from tonight. Your comments make every mystery more thrilling. Now, let's uncover the whisper in Rose Cottage. It was a rare golden afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the sort that seemed to gild the very hedgerows and cast the church steeple in a gentle halo of light. The annual summer garden fete at the vicarage had drawn out nearly every villager, from bustling matrons eager to exhibit their preserves to the youngest schoolchildren darting about with penny toffees sticking to their fingers. Miss Marple sat quietly in a wicker chair at the edge of the lawn, a cup of weak tea balanced neatly upon her lap. Her expression, mild and benign as ever, betrayed nothing of the sharp eyes that missed no detail. She appeared merely to enjoy the merriment, though in truth she was cataloguing every raised eyebrow, every whispered aside, every curious flicker of discontent that so often hid beneath village gaiety. Among the stalls, Mrs. Bantry was presiding with much flourish over the flower arrangements, fussing at a nervous young maid, whose roses drooped under the weight of over-enthusiastic watering. The colonel, standing stiffly beside the darts competition, was loudly proclaiming the superiority of military precision. Though his throat suggested otherwise, it was, on the surface, a picture of perfect English charm. Yet there was, as Miss Marple noted, an undercurrent, something unsaid that stirred uneasily beneath the chatter and bunting. The fate's excitement reached a height when the raffle prizes were displayed. Hampers of jams, a silver teapot and, most curiously, a small painting said to have come from Rose Cottage. It was not of particular artistic merit, an old watercolour of the meadow beyond the village, but it drew an unusual degree of attention. People whispered about it, some with genuine interest, others with a more furtive air. When the winning ticket was finally drawn, the painting went to Mrs. Price Ridley, who accepted it with thin-lipped satisfaction. A ripple of laughter and polite clapping followed, and then, with the fete winding down, villagers began their unhurried strolls homeward. It was then that the peace was shattered. A young maid, pale-faced and trembling, came running from the lane that led past Rose Cottage. Her apron was stained, and her voice faltered as she gasped the words, There's a man in the cottage. He's dead." The chatter ceased instantly, replaced by a collective intake of breath. Miss Marple set down her teacup with delicate precision. Around her, the garden fete dissolved into a storm of speculation and alarm. Rose Cottage, so quaint with its ivy and roses, had become the stage for something quite out of keeping with the village's summer gaiety. A man was dead, and Miss Marple, eyes narrowing ever so slightly, already wondered why the seemingly unimportant watercolour had mattered so very much. Would you like me to continue in the next section with you The Village Reacts, where gossip spreads and the first theories about the crime take shape? The ripple of shock that spread through the vicarage garden was immediate and unrestrained. Villagers who moments before had been contentedly sampling sponge cakes, or gossiping about the comparative quality of roses, now clustered in tents, murmuring knots, their eyes darting in the direction of the lane that led to Rose Cottage. Miss Hartnell, clutching her parasol with white knuckles, declared in a quivering but oddly triumphant voice that she had always said there was something suspicious about that place, and that she, for one, was not at all surprised to hear it was the scene of a dreadful discovery. Colonel Melchett, red in the face and already looking as though he were preparing to take command of a battalion, barked orders at no one in particular. "Stand back, everyone! Stand back! Best not to rush to the scene. Leave it to the proper authorities." His bluster was met with only partial compliance, for half the villagers were far too eager to scuttle off toward the lane, their curiosity stronger than their respect for officialdom. Miss Marple, still seated in her wicker chair, observed this small exodus with the faintest sigh. She knew the ways of human nature too well. Horror, when coupled with curiosity, was irresistible. People wanted to be first to know, to carry back the choicest morsels of gossip. And in St. Mary Mead, a murder, if it were indeed that, would furnish gossip for months, if not years. She rose slowly, folding her hands over the handle of her parasol, and moved with deliberate calm toward the lane. She never hurried. She had learned long ago that truth revealed itself better to the quiet and patient observer. The lane to Rose Cottage was narrow, overhung with branches that dappled the ground with shifting patches of light and shadow. A cluster of villagers had already gathered at the cottage gate, speaking in urgent tones. The maid who had brought the news sat on the low stone wall, trembling, a damp cloth pressed to her forehead by the kindly hand of Mrs. Bantry. Inside the gate, Constable Pritchard, young, earnest, and rather too fond of showing off his authority, was barring entry with a self-important expression. "No one's to go in," he announced, puffing out his chest. "Not until the inspector arrives. Now clear away, all of you. It's a matter of evidence." "Evidence of what, young man?" demanded Miss Hartnell, her sharp voice cutting through the murmur. "You've no idea yet what's happened. The girl said only that a man was dead. It could be an accident, or a fainting fit." But her eyes glittered with the unmistakable relish of scandal, and she leaned closer to her companions, whispering suggestions that grew increasingly lurid. A quarrel over money, a stranger lurking about, some secret assignation gone wrong. Miss Marple, arriving at the gate, inclined her head in polite greeting. The constable, momentarily disarmed, allowed her to peer through the open doorway of the cottage, where a group of men had already gathered around the threshold. Within, in the dim coolness of the parlour, lay the body of a man sprawled beside an overturned chair. His clothes, though dusty, suggested some measure of refinement. A suit of fair quality, though not new. His hair was dishevelled, his face pale, the features unfamiliar to most of those gathered. A faint odour of tobacco lingered in the air. "He's not from the village," someone murmured. "Never seen him before." "An outsider," another agreed, with an undertone that implied everything suspicious could be laid at the feet of outsiders. Miss Marple's eyes, deceptively vague, took in the details others missed. The unnatural angle of the man's arm, the crumpled slip of paper protruding from his pocket, the curious placement of a small vase upon the mantelpiece, as though hastily set there. She asked no questions, offered no remarks, only nodded sympathetically, as Mrs. Bantry explained to her that the poor maid had come to fetch some linen left in the cottage when she discovered the scene. By the time Inspector Slack arrived, the village was a hotbed of speculation. Housewives abandoned their dinners to discuss the matter at garden fences, and men returning from fields or office work found themselves interrogated for opinions before they had time to remove their coats. Theories blossomed with astonishing rapidity. Some insisted the man must be a thief, struck down during a burglary gone awry. Others whispered of debts and secret rendezvous. A few suggested, always in lowered tones, that there might be a connection between the curious painting raffled earlier and the death now discovered at Rose Cottage. Miss Marple listened to all of it, outwardly as absorbed as anyone, yet inwardly filing away each assertion with the quiet efficiency of a mind long trained in the observation of human folly. Gossip, she knew, revealed far more than the speaker intended. It was not in the accuracy of the theories, but in the eagerness, the emphasis, and the omissions that truth often nestled. Inspector Slack, meanwhile, wasted no time in pronouncing his opinion. After a brief examination of the scene, he declared with the air of a man determined to cut through nonsense, "Robbery, clear as day. Stranger comes into the village, sees easy pickings in a quiet cottage, gets into some altercation, and meets his end. Nothing more to it. We'll have the matter settled soon enough." He eyed the villagers sternly, as though daring them to contradict him, and several nodded dutifully, relieved to have the authority of the law pronounce upon the mystery. But Miss Marple's lips twitched ever so slightly. She had seen the inspector fall prey to tidy conclusions before, and she suspected this would be no exception. For all his brusque assurance, there were inconsistencies. Why should a thief trouble himself with a cottage hardly known for valuables? Why should the victim be dressed in clothes of a man of means, hardly a common vagrant? And what of that faint ripple of unease when the painting from Rose Cottage had been displayed at the fête? Such things, to Miss Marple, were worth more than fingerprints or footprints. As twilight fell upon the village, and the gossip swelled to a fever pitch, Miss Marple returned to her quiet home, kettle on the hob and knitting needles waiting. She looked every inch the harmless old lady settling into her evening routine, yet her mind was busy, turning over scraps of conversation, gestures half seen, and that faint detail of the slip of paper in the dead man's pocket. The village, she knew, would not rest easily tonight, but in the quiet of her sitting-room, Miss Marple reflected that murder, when it occurred, was never as simple as Inspector Slack wished to make it. Human beings were infinitely more complex, their motives layered like the petals of the very roses that covered the little cottage now marked by death, and somewhere among those layers lay the truth. The night air in St. Mary Mead seemed unusually heavy, as though the entire village were holding its breath. Curtains twitched as villagers lingered at their windows, lamps burning later than usual. The day's ordinary routine suspended by the extraordinary shadow cast by the discovery at Rose Cottage. In the quiet streets, whispers carried more easily than footsteps. The question lingered everywhere. Who was the man, and why had he died in their midst? At the vicarage, Reverend Clement was attempting to compose his evening sermon, but found his mind continually distracted. His wife, Griselda, young and lively, busied herself with writing letters at the bureau, but her pen paused frequently as she turned to remark with impatience about Inspector Slack's hasty conclusion. A robbery indeed! One would think the man had a handbook of stock answers, and robbery always seems to be his first and last. The Reverend murmured agreement, his tone absent. Even in their home, the atmosphere seemed unsettled, as though the whole village had absorbed some contagion of unease. Elsewhere, similar conversations unfolded. At the Bantry estate, Dolly Bantry entertained her husband with a spirited recounting of every rumour she had collected, embellishing each with her own colourful asides. She was certain there must be some scandal at the heart of it, perhaps involving an affair or secret past. Her husband, weary from her excitement, attempted to dampen her enthusiasm, but failed entirely. Dolly, with the gleam of a born gossip, felt herself almost enlivened by the grim event. At Miss Marple's neat little house, however, the mood was calmer. She sat by the fire, her knitting set aside, her teacup cooling on the table. Her eyes, thoughtful and steady, reflected the flickering flames. She had spoken little throughout the evening, but her mind had not been still. She was tracing the contours of a puzzle that was not yet fully formed. A dead stranger, a slip of paper, a cottage with an unassuming past, and that odd business with the painting. All seemed disconnected on the surface, Yet Miss Marple knew that human affairs rarely existed in such isolation. One string tugged gently often unravelled an entire skein. The following morning brought fresh waves of speculation. Villagers crowded into the grocer's and the post office, their conversations overlapping, each person eager to provide the most compelling version of events. Who had seen the body most clearly? What exactly had been in his pocket? Did anyone know where he had come from? With each retelling, the tale grew, acquiring embellishments like barnacles clinging to a ship. Miss Hartnell, firmly convinced of her own deductions, declared to anyone who would listen that the man had been an escaped convict. "You may depend upon it," she said with solemn certainty, "and I shouldn't be surprised if he had accomplices still lurking about. Mark my words, this will not be the end of it." Her audience nodded with varying degrees of enthusiasm, though a few privately dismissed her theory as dramatic nonsense. Meanwhile, Mrs. Price Ridley, who had won the painting at the fete, found herself the subject of much curiosity. Some hinted darkly that there might be something more to the picture than mere watercolour and faded meadow scenes. Mrs. Price Ridley, proud yet unsettled by the attention, insisted that the matter was nothing but unfortunate coincidence. Still, she kept the painting close, as though it had acquired some peculiar significance by virtue of its connection to the murder. Inspector Slack, brimming with self-importance, returned to the village with his constables to conduct further questioning. He was brisk, methodical, but determined to support his earlier conclusion. He told the assembled villagers that the dead man was almost certainly a thief, interrupted at his work. The contents of his pockets, coins, a handkerchief, and the crumpled paper were, in Slack's view, of no consequence. Yet when pressed about the paper, he admitted reluctantly that it contained a few scribbled words, though he refused to disclose them, citing confidential police matters. This refusal only deepened curiosity. By withholding details, the inspector ensured that gossip would weave its own fabric of invention. Some insisted the paper was a map, others a letter of blackmail, and still others a secret code. The village hummed with speculation like a hive of restless bees. Miss Marple, however, observed quietly, never contradicting nor contributing to the wilder stories. Instead, she let them flow, knowing that people often revealed more than they intended when they embroidered the truth. She made gentle inquiries, never in a manner that seemed probing, but in her mild, almost distracted way that lulled people into careless openness. It was during one such conversation at the grocer's that she noted a curious hesitation in Mrs. Bantry's recounting of events. Dolly, who usually relished every opportunity to embellish, faltered when speaking of the moment the painting was shown. Her eyes flickered, her voice trailed, and she quickly shifted the subject to the dead man's appearance. Miss Marple, with the faintest of nods, tucked this away in her mind. Dolly Bantry had noticed something she was unwilling to voice openly. By afternoon, the village settled into a restless rhythm. The inspector had ordered Rose Cottage sealed, and Constable Pritchard remained stationed at the gate, looking both self-important and faintly uncomfortable at his post. Villagers passed by with feigned nonchalance, their eyes lingering on the ivy-clad walls, as though expecting the cottage itself to yield answers. Miss Marple, on her way to deliver a basket of scones to the vicarage, paused at the gate and exchanged a few words with the constable. He was eager to share his own theories, and she listened with the kind patience that encouraged him to speak more freely than he ought. From his talk, she learned that the dead man's identity remained unknown. No papers on him, no one yet come forward to claim acquaintance. But she also learned something else, that the slip of paper had contained in a hurried hand only 2 words, Rose Cottage. The discovery, though not surprising to Miss Marple, deepened the puzzle. Why would the man carry only that? Was it a destination, a reminder, or a sign meant for someone else entirely? She walked on, her step unhurried, her thoughts quietly occupied. That evening brought an unexpected turn. Word spread swiftly that a woman had come forward, claiming to have seen the dead man in the company of another, not long before his death. Mrs. Lestrange, a mysterious widow recently settled in the village, and already a subject of whispered conjecture, stated that she had observed him near the churchyard path 2 days prior. She offered this information with calm composure, but her revelation sent another ripple through the village. If true, it suggested that the man had been in St. Mary Mead for some days before his death, not simply a passing thief. The villagers seized upon this new detail, each shaping it to fit their own theories. Some insisted he had been lying in wait for some nefarious purpose. Others hinted at secret meetings, assignations by moonlight. Mrs. Lestrange herself became an object of suspicion, her solitary life and enigmatic past suddenly fertile ground for rumour. Miss Marple, hearing the news, merely pursed her lips. Mrs. Lestrange's intervention was curious, not least because it was volunteered rather than extracted. The elderly spinster had the sense that the widow's words were calculated, though to what end remained unclear. She resolved to pay closer attention to Mrs. Lestrange's movements in the days to come. The threads were gathering, though not yet woven. A stranger dead in Rose Cottage, a painting whose significance was yet unspoken, a slip of paper with the cottage's name, and a widow with impeccable timing. To most, it was a confusion of disconnected pieces, but to Miss Marple, the confusion itself was revealing. Human nature, she knew, rarely acted without reason. Behind every whisper and hesitation lay a truth waiting to be uncovered. As night descended once more upon St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat again by her hearth, the click of her knitting needles steady and calm. To anyone looking in, she seemed the picture of domestic tranquillity, but in her eyes there lingered a keen, searching light. She was watching, waiting, and quietly fitting together the puzzle that others could not yet see. The village might talk itself into knots of gossip and speculation, but Miss Marple understood that beneath it all, the truth would emerge, because people, even in their deceptions, always revealed themselves in the end, and in the stillness of her sitting room, she knew with a quiet certainty that the man in Rose Cottage had not come to St. Mary Mead by chance. Morning sunlight filtered into St. Mary Mead with deceptive calm, spilling across neat gardens and whitewashed cottages, painting the village with the appearance of peace. Yet beneath the surface, the unease that had begun with the discovery at Rose Cottage continued to spread. The villagers rose to their daily tasks, but conversations over milk deliveries at the baker's counter and along the hedgerows circled back inevitably to the stranger found dead and the mystery of why he had come to their quiet lanes. At breakfast, the Clements found themselves yet again discussing the matter. Griselda, lively-eyed and exasperated, buttered her toast with unnecessary vigour, as she declared, "The inspector means to settle this whole business by calling it robbery and being done with it. Robbery, when the man had no stolen goods upon him, and only that slip of paper with Rose Cottage written on it. If you ask me, it's far too neat." Her husband, the vicar, attempted mild reason. "The inspector believes in direct explanations, my dear. He finds them efficient." But Griselda laughed sharply. "Efficient, perhaps, but wrong-headed all the same. A body in Rose Cottage is not the sort of thing one tidies away with a word like robbery. There is more to it. I should bet my best hat on that." Elsewhere, Dolly Bantry was still brimming with details she had gathered. recounting them with relish to her husband, who merely grunted behind his newspaper. Dolly, however, was troubled in spite of her appetite for drama. Something about the painting at the fete nagged at her, though she could not quite put it into words. She told herself she was being fanciful. Yet the recollection of the murmurs that had followed its appearance returned to her with unwelcome insistence. She resolved, though not aloud, to call on Miss Marple later. Miss Marple always had a way of seeing sense in things that others brushed aside. For her part, Miss Marple was already considering her morning with quiet purpose. She had risen early, tending to her garden before the village stirred, then seated herself at her small table with tea and toast. She reflected on what she knew. A man unknown, found dead in a cottage not recently inhabited, a slip of paper bearing only the name of that cottage, and a painting once kept there, which had stirred more notice than its modest artistic worth would justify. Added to this was the curious contribution of Mrs. Lestrange, who had introduced herself into the matter with almost theatrical precision. Miss Marple's eyes, pale but sharp, grew thoughtful as she drew parallels with other small dramas she had seen over her long life. People, she mused, rarely entered a stage without reason, and Mrs. Lestrange had chosen her moment with unusual care. By mid-morning, Inspector Slack was once more striding through the village, issuing instructions with a brusque confidence that both reassured and irritated his audience. He had ordered inquiries into inns and boarding-houses in the nearby towns, searching for any trace of the dead man's lodging. Thus far, no one had come forward to identify him. Slack repeated his conclusion with greater emphasis, that the man had been an intruder with criminal intent, and dismissed suggestions of deeper intrigue as village fancy. This only served to fuel the talk, for nothing sharpened speculation so much as being told it was foolish. Some swore the man must have been seeking Mrs. Lestrange herself. Others whispered that Rose Cottage hid some long-buried secret from its previous occupants. In the post office, Miss Hartnell loudly proclaimed that she remembered quite distinctly hearing that the cottage had once belonged to a retired solicitor with questionable dealings. Her story grew more elaborate with each telling, while the postmistress smiled thinly and continued stamping letters. Miss Marple, stopping by the same post office, said nothing to interrupt Miss Hartnell's tale. She only smiled and offered a mild observation about how odd it was that Rose Cottage, long empty and overlooked, should suddenly find itself the centre of such attention. The remark, though gentle, lingered in the minds of those who heard it. That afternoon brought a development which stirred the village afresh. A London solicitor arrived, summoned by the police to view the body. He was a grave, precise man with spectacles that caught the light, and he introduced himself as Mr. Whittaker. His task, he explained, was to assist in identifying the deceased, who, it transpired, might be connected to certain legal affairs. The inspector, with unconcealed triumph, declared that progress was being made. Yet the villagers sensed there was more behind the solicitor's solemn demeanour than he revealed. Miss Marple, catching sight of him at the vicarage when he conferred briefly with the Reverend Clement, noted the way he avoided questions, offering only polite evasions. He knew who the dead man was, or at the very least suspected it, but he was not prepared to disclose it. That, to Miss Marple's mind, was most revealing. She had seen before how solicitors could cloak their knowledge beneath professional discretion, yet human nature betrayed itself in small slips. A tightening of the mouth, a hesitation before answering, a glance too quickly averted. Evening drew on with the matter no less clouded than before. The villagers settled into their homes, fires lit, curtains drawn, but their talk lingered stubbornly on the same subject. Children, sensing their elder's preoccupation, whispered ghostly tales of the dead man in the lane. Housewives speculated whether it was safe to leave windows open at night. Men at the inn declared, over pints of ale, that the inspector ought to widen his net and not be so quick to dismiss other explanations. Miss Marple, in her cottage, resumed her knitting with tranquil fingers. Though her mind was alert, the solicitor's arrival confirmed what she had already suspected. The dead man had not come by chance. He was tied, however indirectly, to Rose Cottage and to whatever secret lay there. The painting, the widow's carefully timed statement, the solicitor's evasions, all threads of a fabric not yet visible, but certain to reveal itself if one only waited and watched. She thought again of the paper found in his pocket, with its single note, Rose Cottage. It was not a reminder for himself. That seemed unlikely. It was a signpost, perhaps, or a message meant for another. People did not write down such things without purpose, and purpose, in matters of life and death, was always telling. As she set her knitting aside for the night, Miss Marple reflected with quiet certainty that Inspector Slack's solution of robbery would not stand. The man in Rose Cottage had come with intent, and that intent had led him to his death. Somewhere among the familiar faces of St. Mary Mead, someone knew why, and Miss Marple, patient as ever, meant to find out. The following morning dawned over St. Mary Mead with a clear, pale sky, and a freshness that belied the unease that lingered beneath the surface of village life. The stillness seemed fragile, as though the very air held its breath in anticipation of what new revelations might unfold. Birds sang merrily in the hedgerows. The milkman's cart rattled along the lanes, and yet behind curtains and in the doorways of shops, the villagers leaned closer, voices lowered, eyes glancing toward Rose Cottage, as though its ivy-covered walls might whisper secrets, if only one stared long enough. Miss Marple began her morning as she always did, tending to her garden with deliberate care. She moved slowly along the flower beds, snipping here, straightening there, her hands steady though her thoughts ranged far from petunias and roses. It was in the quiet of such small labours that she found her mind most able to order the fragments of human nature that made up the puzzle. She thought of Mr. Whittaker, the solicitor, whose professional discretion had been as revealing as an outright admission. He knew more than he said, much more. She thought of Mrs. Lestrange, the widow, who had placed herself in the midst of events with a story too neat to be wholly credible. And she thought, too, of Dolly Bantry, whose eagerness for gossip had slipped, if only for a moment, into unease at the sight of the painting. The painting! That watercolour of a simple meadow, raffled so casually. Yet it had stirred whispers and disquiet even before the body was found. Miss Marple had learned long ago that objects could carry weight far beyond their appearance, especially when connected with past grievances or long-buried secrets. She intended, in her own unobtrusive way, to learn more of its history. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. Dolly Bantry appeared at her garden gate, her face flushed from brisk walking, her manner brimming with half-suppressed excitement. "Jane," she called, "I simply had to speak with you. My dear, I cannot make sense of it. The whole village is in such a state, and I confess, I cannot shake the feeling that there's something dreadfully odd about that painting." Miss Marple ushered her in with gentle courtesy, setting out fresh tea and scones as though it were an ordinary social call. Dolly spoke in a rush, describing again the way the crowd had murmured when the painting was revealed, and how several people had exchanged glances she could not quite interpret. It was as though they recognized something they didn't want to mention, she insisted, and then, with that man dead in the very cottage from which it came, well, One cannot dismiss it as coincidence. Miss Marple listened with the patience of one who knew that hasty conclusions obscured more than they revealed. She asked only mild questions. Who precisely had seemed unsettled? How long the painting had been in the cottage? And who had last owned it? Dolly, in her eagerness, supplied what she could recall. The cottage had been empty for some years, and before that had belonged to a certain Mrs. Henderson, a widow of retiring habits who had died quietly in Bath. The painting, Dolly believed, had been left behind with other furnishings and eventually passed into the hands of the committee organizing the fete. She could not say, however, why its appearance had provoked such interest. Miss Marple poured another cup of tea, nodding thoughtfully. It was often in such overlooked inheritances, she reflected, that one found the seeds of human mischief. What seemed trifles, an old painting, an abandoned cottage, might hold the key to resentments or ambitions carefully concealed. She did not press Dolly further, sensing that her friend had already given all she knew, but she noted the names and details in her mind, fitting them into the growing pattern. Later that day, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the village. She greeted Mrs. Price Ridley, who now kept the painting on proud display in her sitting room. The older woman invited her in, and Miss Marple accepted, her gaze falling at once upon the watercolour. She examined it with quiet attention. The meadow scene was simple, almost naive in execution. A line of trees at the horizon, a cottage roof faintly visible beyond them. Nothing in its artistry explained its significance. Yet Miss Marple noticed a small detail easily overlooked, the faint outline of initials, half faded in one corner. She said nothing, merely complimenting Mrs. Price Ridley on her good fortune in winning such a charming piece. As she left the house, she reflected on the peculiar possessiveness with which Mrs. Price Ridley had spoken of the painting, as though determined to guard it. That, too, was revealing. People often betrayed more in the way they clung to objects than in their words. The village, meanwhile, continued its restless murmur. Inspector Slack had pressed forward with inquiries, but no relative or acquaintance had yet stepped forward to identify the dead man. This only deepened the sense of mystery, and with each passing day, the villagers grew more certain that the answer lay not outside, but within their own community. Rumours multiplied. The man had been blackmailing someone. He had been searching for hidden treasure. He had been connected to espionage. The theories, wild and fanciful, filled the air, yet none provided a true solution. In the evening, Miss Marple attended a small supper at the vicarage, where the talk inevitably returned to Rose Cottage. Griselda, lively as ever, could not resist teasing the inspector, who had dropped by to assure them all that matters were well in hand. Well in hand? She repeated, her voice tinged with amusement. When no one knows who he was, why he was there, or why he had only the name of Rose Cottage in his pocket. My dear Inspector, that hardly seems well in hand at all. Slack bristled, muttering about method and patience, but Miss Marple observed him with quiet eyes. He was too eager to dismiss what he could not yet explain, too determined to fit the puzzle into a box already labelled. That was always a weakness, for truth seldom conformed to expectation. Later, as Miss Marple walked home beneath the moonlight, her steps slow along the familiar path, she turned over the evening's impressions. The solicitor's silence, the widow's calculated revelation, the villager's whispers, the odd significance of the painting, all pointed to something long concealed beneath the ordinary life of St. Mary Mead. And now, with a man dead and secrets stirring, the past was pushing its way inexorably into the present. She paused by her gate, looking back toward the dark silhouette of Rose Cottage in the distance. Human nature, she thought, had a way of leaving traces. No matter how carefully people tried to bury their past, it lingered in gestures, in words, in the things they chose to keep or discard, and in time it would emerge. Inside her cottage, she set her knitting basket by her chair and lit a small lamp. The village might chatter, and the inspector might insist upon robbery. But Miss Marple knew better. The dead man had come for a reason, and that reason was written not only in the slip of paper in his pocket, but in the faces and silences of those who now went about their daily lives pretending at normality. The truth was there, waiting, and Miss Marple, with her quiet persistence and her knowledge of human hearts, meant to find it. The days that followed moved with a peculiar rhythm, as though the very life of St. Mary Mead had altered its pace to accommodate the undercurrent of mystery. The villagers went about their tasks, shopping, tending to gardens, exchanging greetings at the post office. But in every glance and every word there lingered the unspoken weight of the death at Rose Cottage. Life had not stopped, but it no longer felt entirely ordinary. Miss Marple, in her quiet way, noticed how people's habits shifted when unsettled. Mrs. Price Ridley, for instance, had taken to keeping her curtains closed even during the day, only drawing them back in the evening to display the watercolour she had won, as though defying the whispers that clung to it. Dolly Bantry, usually eager for company, seemed both restless and hesitant, torn between her delight in speculation and the nagging disquiet she could not quite put into words. Mrs. Lestrange walked through the village with her customary calm, but her eyes flickered quickly over every face, as though measuring the impression she had made. It was into this atmosphere that Inspector Slack pressed forward with his inquiries. He had discovered at last that the dead man bore the name Henry Lucas, a clerk formerly employed in a solicitor's office in London. The identification, supplied reluctantly by Mr. Whittaker, the London solicitor, seemed to confirm the inspector's original suspicion. A man of questionable character, mixed up in dubious affairs, Slack declared to the Reverend Clement, most likely came here with some dishonest scheme. He stumbled into trouble and paid the price. Yet Miss Marple, listening quietly as this was repeated at the vicarage, only sipped her tea and said nothing. Her mind lingered on the oddity of a clerk from London finding his way to a small village cottage. People did not travel to such places without reason, and the reason, she felt sure, was tied to the painting and to something within Rose Cottage itself. That evening, as she walked home under the fading light, she encountered Dolly Bantry near the green. Dolly, looking slightly flustered, confessed that she had dreamt of the painting the previous night. "I know it sounds silly, Jane," she said, "but I kept seeing that little meadow and the roof of the cottage just peeping over the trees. It was as though it were trying to tell me something." She laughed nervously at her own words, but Miss Marple regarded her with gentle seriousness. Dreams, fanciful though they were, often drew upon things one had noticed but not consciously acknowledged. Dolly's unease might point to some detail that had escaped her attention. "Tell me, my dear," Miss Marple asked softly, "when you looked at the painting during the fête, who seemed most interested?" Dolly frowned, knitting her brows as she thought. "Well, several people looked at it, but not in the usual way. Not admiring, you understand, but rather watching. I thought at the time that Mrs. Lestrange seemed a little too attentive, and Mr. Hawes, the curate, though he said nothing, kept glancing at it, as though he recognized something he would not admit. At least that was the impression I had." Miss Marple nodded, filing away the information without comment. People revealed themselves in such small observations. Later, She would reflect on why a widow and a curate might both be troubled by a painting of a meadow. The following morning, the village was once again stirred when Constable Pritchard, stationed at Rose Cottage, was heard to say that a drawer inside had been rifled during the night. No sign of forced entry was found, yet papers that had been left there were scattered across the floor. Slack, exasperated, dismissed it as mischief by curious locals, but Miss Marple thought otherwise. Such interference suggested someone was searching for something they believed still hidden within the cottage. The question was what and why? She decided to pay a call upon Mrs. Lestrange, whose presence in the village had always been tinged with mystery. The widow received her politely, though with a reserve that did not escape notice. The drawing-room was sparsely furnished, with a few personal objects carefully arranged. Miss Marple's gaze fell upon a small silver frame containing a faded photograph of a young man. She made no remark, but she noted the way Mrs. Lestrange shifted slightly, as though to draw attention away from it. Their conversation was courteous, the widow speaking in well-measured phrases. Yet when Miss Marple, in her gentle, almost distracted tone, remarked upon the oddness of Rose Cottage becoming the focus of so much attention, she observed a flicker in the other woman's eyes, a fleeting shadow of recognition or fear. Mrs. Lestrange recovered quickly, changing the subject to village matters. But the impression lingered. Miss Marple had long ago learned that such fleeting expressions spoke volumes more than words. That evening, returning home, Miss Marple paused by her garden gate and looked once more toward Rose Cottage. The ivy clung thickly to its walls, the roses blooming pale in the twilight. To most, it was an ordinary, even charming country dwelling. But Miss Marple knew that cottages, like people, could harbour secrets long concealed, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The painting, the dead man, the silence of those who knew more than they said, all were threads converging on that quiet little house. And in the days to come, she was certain, those threads would tighten. Someone in the village, someone who smiled and gossiped and pretended to normality, was bound to slip. And when they did, Miss Marple would be there, watching with her calm, unhurried eyes, ready to see what others had missed. The disturbance at Rose Cottage, the rifled drawer, the scattered papers, lingered in the minds of the villagers with a potency even greater than the original discovery of the body. For while death, however shocking, could be explained away by the inspector's insistence on robbery or misadventure, the intrusion after the fact suggested something more deliberate, something ongoing. The idea that the dead man's presence had not ended the affair, but rather begun it, unsettled St. Mary Mead to its very core. Miss Marple, listening to the talk at the greengrocer's, noted how quickly suspicion leapt from one person to another. Mr. Hawes! The curate was whispered about because of his nervous manner, though the poor young man seemed scarcely capable of a misdemeanour. Mrs. Lestrange was cited again and again, her aloofness and self-possession making her a ready target. And there were mutterings, too, about Mrs. Price Ridley, whose sudden attachment to the painting she had won struck many as peculiar. Inspector Slack, however, had grown impatient with village chatter. He announced with great firmness that the disturbance at Rose Cottage was no more than the work of nosy villagers poking where they oughtn't. He brushed aside the notion of hidden motives, declaring that the case was nearly settled, and that the coroner's inquest would bring it to its tidy conclusion. His manner was brisk, his tone dismissive, and yet Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner of the vicarage drawing-room when he spoke these words, observed a faint tightness around his eyes. Slack was not as certain as he pretended. It was in this atmosphere that Miss Marple decided upon a small but purposeful errand. She asked Dolly Bantry, who was always willing for an outing when curiosity was involved, to accompany her on a walk for the air. Their path, not by accident, led them past Rose Cottage, where Constable Pritchard stood at his post once more, looking both bored and uncomfortable. Miss Marple engaged him in mild conversation, inquiring after his health and his mother's rheumatism. In the course of such kindly chatter, she drew out the admission that nothing of real value had been found in the rifled drawer. Only some old receipts, an unused notebook, and a yellowed letter of no great clarity. But Miss Marple did not miss the way Pritchard's eyes shifted when she asked, in the mildest of tones, whether the letter had been examined closely. "Not my business to say, ma'am," he muttered before quickly changing the subject. It was clear enough to her that the letter was of more interest than he was permitted to reveal. After they walked on, Dolly turned to her eagerly. "You see, Jane, there must be something in that cottage still, or else why would anyone bother to break in?" Miss Marple agreed in her soft way, though she did not share the full weight of her thoughts. People seldom risked discovery unless the reward were worth it. If something lay hidden in Rose Cottage, it was not trifling. That evening, as the lamps were lit in her neat sitting-room, Miss Marple considered all that she had observed. The painting with its faint initials, the dead man, identified as Henry Lucas, once a clerk in a solicitor's office, the widow, Mrs. Lestrange, whose calm exterior barely veiled some deeper anxiety, and now a letter, yellowed with age, found in a drawer of Rose Cottage, and treated with curious discretion. She knew enough of life to recognize the pattern. Something buried in the past had risen again, drawing to it both the innocent and the guilty. The following day, a new development spread like wildfire through the village. It was whispered that Mrs. Lestrange had been seen at twilight walking alone near the churchyard, her face pale, her step unsteady. Some claimed she had been weeping, others that she had stood gazing at the graves with an expression of dread. Whatever the truth, it added to the air of mystery surrounding her. Why should a woman of her independence and composure betray such visible agitation? Miss Marple, hearing this account from the vicar's maid, made no exclamation, but her lips pressed together thoughtfully. It was never in her nature to dismiss such observations as idle tales. People often embroidered what they saw, but at the heart of such gossip lay a kernel of truth. Mrs. Lestrange was entangled, of that Miss Marple felt increasingly sure, but the reason for her involvement was not yet plain. That afternoon, as Miss Marple sat knitting by the window, Dolly Bantry came bustling in, breathless with news. "Jane, you'll never believe it. They say the inspector questioned Mrs. Lestrange this morning, quite directly too. And do you know what she said? That she had never set foot inside Rose Cottage in her life. Imagine that, such a flat denial. And yet, why should she make it unless someone suspected her of it?" Miss Marple looked up, her knitting needles paused. "Yes, Dolly," she said mildly, "and one must always ask oneself whether a denial is meant to put suspicion to rest, or whether it serves rather to call attention to the very thing denied. Human nature, my dear, is a most curious thing." The conversation stayed with her long after Dolly departed. People lied for many reasons: fear, pride, guilt, or even to protect another. The art lay in discerning which motive applied, and how it tied into the larger picture. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Lestrange's denial was of great importance, though in what way she had not yet determined. That night, as the village grew quiet and the moon cast pale light upon the thatched roofs and winding lanes, Miss Marple sat alone in her parlour, her thoughts as steady as her hands upon her knitting. each fragment of the puzzle, the man, the painting, the letter, the widow's denial, was a piece waiting to be set in its place. She knew from long experience that patience was required. The truth, however carefully hidden, would emerge in time, for people were never as consistent in their deceptions as they imagined. And somewhere among her neighbours, behind the familiar faces and polite greetings, was someone who knew exactly why Henry Lucas had come to Rose Cottage and why he had died there. The days that followed Mrs. Lestrange's emphatic denial deepened the air of unease in St. Mary Mead. On the surface, life pressed forward with the usual rhythm. Washing hung from lines, hens pecked in the dust of back gardens, and postmen cycled dutifully along the narrow lanes. But there was no mistaking the tension that underlay every ordinary moment. It was as though the village itself had taken to whispering, and the subject of every whisper was Rose Cottage, Rose Cottage, Rose. Miss Marple, outwardly as serene as ever, sat in her garden chair with her knitting, her blue eyes half veiled beneath pale lashes. But beneath the calm exterior, her mind moved with quiet determination, weighing each word, each hesitation, and each contradiction she had observed. She knew instinctively that the truth did not lie in grand gestures or sensational revelations, but in the smallest details of human behaviour. People, in her experience, betrayed themselves most clearly when they believed they were safe from notice. The inspector's confidence had not diminished, though his temper seemed to fray more quickly when pressed for details. He had informed the vicar that the coroner's inquest would be set for the following week, and he hoped it would bring the affair to a close. His words carried the firmness of officialdom, but there was something defensive beneath them, a need to assert order where he himself sensed confusion. Miss Marple had seen it often before. Men of authority disliked puzzles that did not yield to simple explanations, and Slack was determined to force this one into the mould of robbery. However ill-fitting it might be, the village, however, was far less inclined to accept such neat conclusions. Rumours spread more quickly than fire in dry grass. At the bakery, Mrs. Hartnell declared with great conviction that Mrs. Lestrange had once been acquainted with the dead man in London. At the grocer's, old Mr. Larkin insisted that the stranger had been searching for hidden money left behind by the previous owner of Rose Cottage. And at the inn, over mugs of ale, one man swore he had heard from his cousin's friend that the dead man had been engaged in blackmail. Each tale contradicted the next, yet each was delivered with equal fervour. Miss Marple, strolling through these conversations, nodded kindly, never contradicting. She listened, as she always did, not for accuracy, but for the little slips of tone or emphasis that revealed what truly lay beneath. Gossip, she knew, was less about the subject than about the speaker. It was in their eagerness, their defensiveness, or their delight that one discerned what mattered. One afternoon, as she returned from the vicarage, she was stopped at the gate by Dolly Bantry, whose face was flushed with agitation. "Jane, I must tell you, Mrs. Price Ridley has been saying she means to sell the painting. Can you imagine it? After all her talk of keeping it, she now claims it brings her no peace. And she has already had an inquiry. A man from London, no less, asking after it." Miss Marple's expression remained mild, but her heart quickened. That, she thought, was the first tangible sign that the painting was indeed at the centre of the affair. A painting no one had valued suddenly attracting interest from London. Bespoke significance not in its artistry, but in what it concealed. She asked Dolly in her quiet way who the man was, but Dolly had only fragments to offer. He had written through an agent, his name not yet clear. and he had hinted at a generous price. That evening Miss Marple allowed herself a longer study of the painting, which Mrs. Price Ridley had permitted her to view once more. The watercolour, for all its simplicity, carried an air of something concealed. The initials faintly visible in the corner, so easily dismissed, had the look of a personal mark, not the hand of a professional artist. Miss Marple knew enough of village life to understand how such things could become entangled with inheritance, with family quarrels, with secrets best left unsaid. She did not touch upon these thoughts aloud, but she carried them with her as she left, her knitting bag swinging gently at her side. The next day brought another ripple through the village, when it was reported that the letter found in the drawer at Rose Cottage had been examined by Mr. Whittaker, the solicitor. Though the inspector gave away nothing, word slipped out, as word always did, that the letter concerned an old transaction involving property boundaries. The details were murky, but the connection to land, however tenuous, was enough to set tongues wagging. For in small communities, land was a thing both practical and personal, tied to pride and resentment in equal measure. Miss Marple, hearing this, remembered Dolly's unease about the painting and the curate's odd glances during the fete. A meadow in the watercolour, a letter concerning boundaries, a dead man from a solicitor's office. It was too much to dismiss as chance. The thought formed slowly, like a shape emerging from mist, that the painting itself might serve not as art, but as evidence, a visual record of something disputed long ago. Such a thing could matter greatly if inheritance or ownership hung upon it. That evening, walking home from the vicarage, Miss Marple paused once more near Rose Cottage. The ivy clung thickly, the roses pale against the dimming sky, and in the silence she could almost imagine the walls themselves holding their breath. It was not the house alone that kept secrets, but those who had ties to it, ties perhaps long forgotten by most, but never by all. As she let herself into her own cottage, she reflected with quiet conviction that the dead man, Henry Lucas, had not come to St. Mary Mead on a whim. He had come because of Rose Cottage, because of what it contained or represented, and someone in the village, someone who smiled and gossiped like the rest, had known he was coming, and had reason enough to ensure he never left. The pieces were shifting closer now, aligning in ways that revealed connections beneath the surface. Miss Marple, seated once more by her lamp with her knitting in hand, thought of the simple truths she had always known. That people lied, that they hid, that they betrayed themselves in their eagerness to conceal. The inspector might cling to robbery, but she saw a darker pattern forming, and she knew, with the quiet certainty born of long observation, that the time was coming when someone would falter. Someone would let slip the truth that tied the painting, the letter, the cottage, and the dead man together. She would be there when it happened, ready to catch the faintest tremor of guilt in a voice, the smallest shadow across a face. For human nature, however carefully guarded, could never resist betraying itself in the end. Miss Marple rose earlier than usual the next morning, her thoughts turning with unusual insistence to the painting and the letter. The matter of property boundaries was, on the surface, dry and unremarkable. Yet she had lived long enough in St. Mary Mead to know that nothing stirred resentment so bitterly as questions of land. A strip of meadow, a hedgerow misplaced, a cottage standing where some believed it ought not. Such things, small as they might seem, had been the fuel of quarrels that smouldered for generations. She put on her hat and gloves with quiet precision, and stepped into the bright morning, the air cool and clear. Her path took her first to the vicarage, where Griselda Clement was in her usual state of lively distraction, pouring tea while bemoaning the inspector's obstinacy. Slack insists upon robbery still, Jane, though half the village could tell him otherwise. He is so determined to tidy it up that he will not see what stares him in the face. But then men do have that tendency. She smiled impishly, though her eyes betrayed curiosity. And you, my dear, what do you make of it all? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her knitting bag resting upon her lap. And I think, my dear Griselda, that one must always ask what purpose lies beneath an action. A man does not travel from London to St. Mary Mead without cause. If it were robbery, there are easier places to ply such a trade. If it were blackmail, there would be evidence of it in his pockets. But he carried only one word: Rose Cottage. That seems to me deliberate. He came here for that house, and the house, or what it contains, was reason enough for his death. The Reverend, who had been silent until now, stirred with unease. It troubles me, Jane, deeply troubles me. I cannot help but feel that there is something unchristian in the eagerness with which people here seize upon one another's names and motives. And yet I must admit you are right. It is not robbery. It is something rooted here, in this place. He sighed, his mild eyes troubled. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked on toward the green, where she encountered Dolly Bantry, her friend already buzzing with the latest morsel of gossip. Dolly had learned that the solicitor, Mr. Whittaker, had spent much of the previous day in quiet conference with Mrs. Lestrange. "And what do you make of that, Jane? She denied ever stepping into Rose Cottage, yet here she is, in long private conversation with the very man who identified the body. Oh, it will not do. She knows more than she lets on." Miss Marple merely nodded, though inside she felt the faint tightening of certainty. Mrs. Lestrange had not placed herself in this matter by chance. Her connection to Henry Lucas, whether distant or close, was undeniable. The denial of ever entering Rose Cottage, when combined with a hidden meeting with the solicitor, rang hollow. People often lied clumsily, not realizing how little they disguised themselves. That afternoon Miss Marple paid another call upon Mrs. Price Ridley under the pretext of admiring the painting once more. She observed the older woman carefully, noting the stiffness of her tone when she spoke of the London inquiry. I shall not part with it so lightly," she declared, though her eyes shifted toward the picture in a way that betrayed a certain anxiety. Why should strangers in London suddenly take such an interest in a watercolour of no value? It is almost peculiar. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice mild, almost absent-minded. "It is curious, is it not? One would almost think the picture recorded something, not of beauty but of use. A feature of land, perhaps, that might matter more in law than in art." She smiled gently and changed the subject, speaking of roses and mildew. But she had seen the way Mrs. Price Ridley's lips pressed tightly, as though her words had struck too close to some private speculation. As she walked home through the fading afternoon, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the curate, Mr. Hawes. Dolly had been right. He had looked oddly at the painting during the fete, as though recognizing something he would rather not. The young man was earnest and devout, but also awkward and easily flustered. It was in such natures, Miss Marple knew, that truths sometimes slipped unguarded. She resolved to speak with him soon, not with direct questions, but with the gentle probing that encouraged confidences. That evening, the inspector arrived at the vicarage with news that stirred the village afresh. The letter from Rose Cottage, when fully examined, contained references to a long-standing dispute over the boundary between the meadow and the church land. The matter, though dormant for years, had evidently been of great consequence once, involving questions of inheritance. The inspector dismissed it as irrelevant. Old quarrels, long past. But Miss Marple knew better. Old quarrels had a way of festering beneath the surface, waiting only for the right moment to erupt. Later, as Miss Marple sat by her fire with her knitting, the click of her needles steady, her mind arranged the pieces once more. A dead man, once a solicitor's clerk, a letter about property boundaries hidden in Rose Cottage, a painting of a meadow marked with faint initials suddenly sought after, a widow who denied too much, and a curate whose eyes betrayed recognition. She thought of the roses outside the cottage, blooming sweetly as though to mock the tragedy within. Roses, she reflected, concealed thorns beneath their beauty. So it was with people, and so it was with the quiet houses of English villages. Outwardly serene, yet within their walls they held secrets sharp enough to wound. The truth, Miss Marple knew, was close. It hovered at the edge of sight, waiting only for the final slip, the final word unguarded, to bring it into the open. And she, with her quiet patience, would be there to see it. For human nature could never hide itself forever, and soon someone in St. Mary Mead would reveal why Henry Lucas had come to Rose Cottage, and why he had not lived to leave it. Miss Marple sat quietly at the vicarage drawing-room, her knitting resting untouched in her lap, while the inspector paced the carpet with his usual impatience. Dolly Bantry perched on the edge of a chair, eyes wide with anticipation, while the Reverend Clement looked on with troubled curiosity. Mrs. Lestrange, pale but composed, had been asked to attend, along with Mr. Whittaker the solicitor, and young Mr. Hawes the curate sat nervously twisting his hands. It was, in truth, a gathering of those most entangled in the matter, though none yet knew quite why they had been summoned. Inspector Slack cleared his throat, already bracing himself for another of Miss Marple's observations. He had learned, reluctantly, that the old lady's quiet musings had a way of undermining his tidy theories, and tonight there was something in the air, a sense that the matter was coming to its head. Miss Marple began in her gentle, almost apologetic voice, as though she were discussing nothing more consequential than a recipe for jam. You see, it was not robbery, nor chance, nor even blackmail. It was something rather simpler, and rather older. Human quarrels, like human affections, do not vanish merely because time has passed. They lie in wait, ready to return when the occasion offers. Her pale eyes moved from face to face, resting for a moment on the painting propped upon the side table. That watercolour, dismissed by most as worthless, is in fact a record. The initials faintly in the corner belong to the former owner of Rose Cottage, who painted it not for beauty, but for proof. The meadow, the hedgerow, the angle of the roof. These details marked out a boundary, long disputed between the cottage and the adjoining church land. A dull matter to most, but of great importance where inheritance is concerned. The letter found in the drawer confirmed the dispute, but the painting was the true evidence. A murmur ran through the room, quickly stilled by the inspector's sharp look. Miss Marple continued, unhurried. Henry Lucas was once a clerk in a London office where those papers had passed. He knew of the dispute and, more importantly, that the evidence had been left in Rose Cottage. He came here to recover it, whether for himself or for another. But he was not the only one who knew. Her gaze fell, gentle but piercing, upon Mrs. Lestrange. The widow's composure trembled, though she did not look away. "You told us you had never set foot in Rose Cottage," Miss Marple said softly. "But that was not quite true. You knew Henry Lucas from before. Indeed, he once acted for your late husband in legal matters. You recognized him when he came to the village, and you feared what his presence would reveal. For if the painting proved the meadow belonged to Rose Cottage, it would undo the arrangement that secured your income, the arrangement that allowed you to live quietly here. You denied the cottage because you wished to deny any connection at all." Mrs. Lestrange gave a faint cry, her hand trembling against her breast. But Miss Marple did not falter. "Yet it was not you who struck the fatal blow. You are, I think, a woman who hides but does not kill. The truth lies elsewhere." Her eyes moved now to the curate, who flushed scarlet under her steady regard. "Mr. Hawes, you looked at the painting with recognition at the fate. You knew what it meant. You are not so timid as you appear. You have ambition, and the discovery of such evidence would imperil the Church's claim to land. It has long considered its own. You were afraid that Lucas had come to press the matter, perhaps to sell the proof to those who would use it against you. When you confronted him at Rose Cottage, tempers rose, and in the struggle he fell. You had not planned it, but once it was done, you seized upon the easiest explanation, that of a thief, a stranger, a matter for the police to dismiss." The curate's lips parted, a denial trembling on them, but none came. The silence of the room pressed in, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Mrs. Lestrange covered her face with her hands, while Mr. Whittaker's grave expression confirmed what Miss Marple had laid bare. Inspector Slack, though reluctant, could not gainsay the logic of it. The letter, the painting, the recognition in the curate's eyes, all aligned. Human fear, human ambition, human folly. These had led to Lucas's death. Miss Marple folded her hands neatly upon her lap, her voice soft but firm. "It is always so, I find. People believe they act from necessity or duty or even righteousness, but beneath it is fear, and fear drives them to folly. Murder is seldom born of grand passions. It is the small, ordinary motives, the loss of security, the dread of exposure, that turn a hand to violence." The curate, pale and shaken, whispered a broken prayer as Slack stepped forward, grim now with his duty. Dolly Bantry exhaled in astonishment, her hand to her chest, while Griselda, wide-eyed, murmured, "Well, I never. Jane, you do astonish me." Miss Marple only smiled faintly, already reaching for her knitting. Outside, the village lay quiet beneath the stars, the roses climbing over Rose Cottage, breathing their fragrance into the night. Life in St. Mary Mead would return to its ordinary rhythm, gossip drifting once more to recipes and gardens, though with an undercurrent of unease that would linger long after. And Miss Marple, in her quiet way, reflected as she set her needles clicking again. Human nature was endlessly curious, endlessly frail. People lied, they feared, they hid, but in the end they always revealed themselves. All one had to do was watch and wait.